120 frames, full frame global shutter. This is the Sony A9 Mark III. So it is way too hot out here to be shooting this, but I want to shoot in some of a fancy background. So let's talk about the design of the Sony A9 Mark III. Now the first thing I noticed about this camera when I picked it up, it was actually very similar in size and design of the Sony A7 III or the Sony A1. Now it's not that great a difference in terms of weight. The Sony A9 Mark III weighs about 617 grams, whereas the Sony A7 III and all the camera weighs 650 grams. This of course is with the batteries inside them. The Sony A1 also weighs 700 grams. So with this camera, it's a high-end camera, but it's not an incredibly heavy sort of camera, which is going to be a big deal as you do sort of want to invest in some very long-range lenses to make the most out of this camera. So you want as little weight on the body as possible because a lot of that weight is going to be in your lens. Now, another great thing about the design of this camera is, while this is a photographer's camera and photographers are rarely sort of in front of the camera, you do have a full-way axis tilt screen. So it can flip out to the front, so you can sort of do some selfie content, some, vlogging, whatever. But you also have this little cool tilt here. So you can actually get some really sort of cool looking sort of shapes going on here. It's actually quite amazing. Now you also of course have some physical dials here for your own adjustments, and I really do actually prefer a lot of physical dials on my camera. It's much easier to navigate, especially say when you're in a dark environment. You kind of sort of want to feel your way around and memorize that. And what's also nifty is you do have an extra custom button at the front here, C5 here. So that's much easier to reach, much closer to your shutter button, so you can have some good quick custom functions on the front near your shutter button. Now personally, they did say they improved the grip, and honestly I don't really know the difference, but I did show this camera to a few Sony users and they have told me that it has improved a bit. It's much easier to hold. Although the folks with much bigger hands do say that there is still a problem of being, well, a Sony camera where it's a fairly small camera. So you have like 2 fingers sort of hanging off the camera at all times. But that's why it's good to invest in a battery pack like this one here. Not only do you have sort of extra batteries, you do drastically change the shape of the camera. So it's much more comfortable for those of you who have bigger hands and want to be a bit more comfortable with your photography. Now in terms of SD cards, this camera does have 2 ports which fit both standard SD cards and CF Express A cards. Although honestly, I'm going to invest in CF Express A cards as I find that the SD cards are they're just getting too weak for the performance of cameras nowadays. You need faster, stronger cards, and honestly, CF Express, CFast cards, these honestly are the future. SSD drives, the standard SD cards, look, they're just not sort of keeping up. If you're starting out, maybe they're good, but really this is a high-end camera with a lot of high-end performance. So you do really want to make the most of that. So when you buy this camera, if you buy this camera, be sure to invest in CF Express A cards. Another great thing about the sensor on this camera is you do actually have a closed gate when the camera is off. Now this closed gate is going to obviously be fantastic for when you say swapping out lenses, need that little extra bit of protection, or maybe you've just forgot to put the cap on your body for whatever reason, and also a second layer of protection on top of the body cap itself. Although I will say that while this is a great bit of protection, it is a little slow when switching on to off. So I might switch this camera on, take the lens off, then switch it off, and it will take a second or a few seconds for the gate to actually close. And honestly, if you have that bit of protection, I do want that gate to close almost immediately. So maybe that comes in a software update, but for now, it's honestly just way too slow for me. So I'm inside now, away from the 30-degree heat. I'm pretty sure I got heat stroke, but let's talk about the most biggest selling points of this camera. So one of the big selling points of this camera is it actually has a full frame global shutter. Now, typically with cameras, you have what's basically called a progressive shutter, where the image gets sort of processed top down, so like so. And what this does is you do basically get what's called rolling shutter distortion, where the image will sort of distort. So if it's a fast moving, say, baseball bat, it will sort of start to curve in the imagery. But with a global shutter, you don't have that progressive shutter. It's not getting processed top down, it's getting processed simultaneously. The whole thing, it's almost like a stamp. It just goes like so. And basically what's significant about this is means you don't have that rolling shutter distortion anymore. It's completely gone from this camera. So if you have a fast moving object, you can be sure that that sort of weird distortion is completely removed, which is going to be beneficial for a lot of people, particularly If you're into sports photography where people are sort of swinging golf clubs and bats around, you don't have that little weird sort of curvedness to it. It also completely removes banding, as with LCD screens, as it's technically a light that's sort of moving top down, you do get that banding. So you get those weird bits of lines across LCD screens. That's gone now because, again, you have a full frame global shutter just sort of printing the image in one go. Another benefit is it's also beneficial to people who are shooting video, as if you notice when you're sort of shooting panning shots with a progressive shutter, you get this sort of jello effect where basically everything looks a bit wobbly. It's because basically the bottom of the image is catching up with the top. So you get that wobbly sort of effect. But when you shoot with a global shutter like the Sony A9III, it actually maintains its stillness. It sort of is, more true to what you're sort of seeing. Honestly, yeah, if you do care about video in terms of not sort of having that weird sort of wobbliness, this is definitely going to be a camera for you. The next big selling point about this camera, and probably the thing that this camera is going to be most well known for outside of its global shutter, is basically it does have a ridiculously fast readout speed of 120 frames per second at 14 RAW. Basically, this means you can shoot a ridiculous amount of photos in a single moment with a shutter speed of 1/80,000th of a second. So a very sort of fast readout speed. You can capture some very precise moments without having to worry necessarily about timing it as well as you would have to with other cameras. You also have zero blackout, so you don't have to worry about sort of any blackness. You can capture everything provided your shutter button is, working. And that's the next thing, is that this camera also does help to remove that timing factor, as you do have pre-capture. Now what pre-capture is basically if you hold the shutter button halfway down, it will capture several images before the actual image where you press the shutter button. So this means you don't actually have to worry about timing out your images. So if you're, say, shooting sports photography where you really do want to time it with that tennis ball hitting that tennis racket, you don't have to be too precise with it. You can sort of get a rough approximation of within a second of that ball hitting a tennis racket, and then from there you can basically just sort of pick the perfect image for you. Something else that's really important to note about this camera is that the performance will be affected depending on what lens you use. So if you use, say, a third-party lens, the frame rate will usually be sort of locked off at around 10 frames or 15 frames per second when it comes to shooting photos, and you will see that in the results. But if you use a first-party lens or a GM lens, you will notice a significant improvement in the performance of this camera's photography. So as is typical with the A9 series, this camera really does thrive on its more first-party lenses. The one setback, of course, having that pre-capture is you do end up building up a absolutely insane backlog of photos, like 6,000 to 8,000 photos from a given day. You can get really carried away when shooting with this camera. So do make sure that you have a good amount of space for all your photos, or at least getting a lot pickier, as you can get really crazy with this camera. And what you're going to notice when you're doing that is every time you shoot that huge batch of photos, the camera is going to need a second to sort of process all of them. So you're not going to be able to go no, you're going to have to basically wait for the camera to process every respective batch of photos. And the issue there is if you're using a very sort of low end or basic sort of SD card, you are going to have an issue where it's just going to be a very slow sort of process. It's going to take a while for it to read out all those photos. But there is a workaround with it, and it's going to be the thing I've been suggesting throughout this video, which is to invest in a CF Express card, as they're much faster, they're much stronger, and really the SD card, you want an SD card that can perform very quickly, as the benefit of this camera, of course, is getting a ridiculous amount of moments within a small space of time, and you don't want to have to wait for your camera to sort of read through every single batch. Now the autofocus is, well, pretty bloody good. It has 759 points of autofocus, and it can track at 120 frames per second, which is actually double the Sony A9 II. So you're getting that improved performance when it comes to autofocus with the Sony A9 III. You also do have the typical expected subject detection from the Sony cameras at this point. You've got people, animals, vehicles, birds. The autofocus honestly is incredibly persistent when it comes to photography. It just locks onto its subject. It doesn't matter how radically they're moving around or if they're necessarily moving behind a bush. If you have your right subject detection set, it will stay stuck onto your subject. Now this is for photos, and honestly this is more of a photography camera than it is a video camera, so I am glad to say that its autofocus is absolutely perfect when it comes to, well, photography. But for video, it's given that a lot of people are going to sort of be shooting like sports photography or animals or just a lot of fast moving moments. Shooting photo, it's great, but for whatever reason you want to switch out to video, you aren't going to have that, same level of autofocus performance. It is going to be a bit off. The autofocus performance does work great provided the subject is sort of within a certain depth of field, like within a reasonable range. But if they're traveling sort of very far out to very far in, it is going to basically struggle to sort of grab that subject initially. The camera also has a dial on top that sort of allows you to switch between different autofocus settings. So this is again going to be beneficial if you have all sorts of different types of subjects. Fantastic. So let's talk about the image quality of this camera while shooting with this camera. So this is basically a 24.6 megapixel full frame sensor. So it is great that, it's full frame. You kind of expect that of a lot of cameras nowadays, but it is a bit of a shame that this high-end camera is only 24.6 megapixels, which means you don't have as much room to sort of crop in with this camera, which is going to be a big deal if you plan to use this camera for a lot of sports photography, or if you're sort of shooting far from, say, the podiums of a lot of sports players or dogs, horses, whatever's running. And basically, you won't have that option to crop in as much at 24.6 megapixels. So this is going to go back to you having to invest in some very long lenses to sort of cover that distance, unfortunately. But in terms of video quality, this camera also has 4K video with a color profile of 10-bit at 422 with a full resolution format of XAVC HS. And if you're not a fan of sort of doing the color grading, you're not much of a videographer to begin with, you do also have the S-Cinetone option in this camera, which gives your camera a quick sort of color grade on its video. So if you just need to, for whatever reason, shoot some quick video and just need it to look nice right out of the card, you do have the S-Cinetone option. In terms of the ISO capabilities of this camera, it honestly is a little bit of a shame, as the base ISO on video is 250 and the base ISO on photo is 125. So that's honestly fairly high in terms of ISO, so you are probably going to have to rely on flash and also depend on the max aperture of your lens. Although a flash, if you're taking pictures of animals, is probably not going to be ideal. So it is a bit of a shame, the ISO capabilities. I was sort of hoping for something a little bit lower in order to sort of make the most of those really high shutter speeds, but that's not the case, unfortunately. I should also note that if you are using S-Cinetone, the base ISO actually even goes higher up on video, up to 320. So again, you are going to have to rely on a lot stronger lighting, a lot lower apertures on your lenses in order to really get a clear image out of this camera. For the photos, you also do have composite RAW, which is great. So you can combine up to 32 images into one and reduce the blurriness and shakiness of the image, and also have a very sort of high resolution looking image, which does sort of help a little bit out with the fact that this is a 24.6 megapixel sensor. So you might be able to crop in just a little bit more now that you have that extra bit of sharpness. Another great thing that's a first for the Sony Alpha is this camera does shoot at 120 frames in slow and quick in full frame. So this is fantastic, as if you ever sort of want to make some quick cool video for a client and just want to make it look cool, honestly, you just shoot it in slow-mo at 120 frames and everyone thinks it looks amazing. You can make anything look good at 120 frames, in all honesty. You could have a boring conference, and if it's in slow-mo, people will be like, whoa, this guy's legit. So 120 frames, full frame, that's a first for the Alpha series, and that is, again, a great sort of capability. It's something that's fantastic for video, but if you're not big on video, it's still, a really nice thing to have. Stabilisation. So this is very similar to the autofocus on most Sony cameras. It's sort of a standard that's expected at this point, and I'm glad to say the Sony A9III does hit that standard. It's a 5-axis stabilization at 8 stops. Fantastic. It does have a dynamic stabilization option, although honestly I find that to be just a little bit wobbly, but you can sort of see the stabilization comparisons here, and well, yeah, stabilization is great if you really hate tripods. So I did actually get help on this video. I got in contact with Cameron at digiDirect Parramatta, who got me in contact with an absolute nutter when it comes to Sony cameras called Nathan. But anyway, thank you Nathan for helping us out on this video, and I'm going to cut away to Nathan's opinions on the Sony A9III.
Nathan! My name's Nathan. I come out and take photos of dogs every day at a park, sometimes birds out here at the canal, and I've been looking for a camera that's faster than my A7R5, and here I am. A9III is freakishly fast, to the point where I would say it's almost ridiculous, but then you look at the playback and you go, oh, hang on a minute, that's actually ridiculously useful. I usually work with dogs, so I can get that perfect spot where the dog's wagging its tail in the right direction, the foot's up in the right spot. 120 frames a second is just bonkers. So I've only had the A1 for a few days. I went out and bought one the other day while waiting for this to arrive, and I must say the focus on it is so much faster. The A9III just grabs an eye from like 50 meters away and just sticks on it. The A1 will get the same eye, but probably it needs, I say, half the distance to work with. So I can get, say, 50 meters away with the A9III. I need to wait till they're about 20, 25 for the A1 to grab it. But once it grabs it, it just sticks on. The dog can be sprinting, it can be stationary, it just stays exactly where I want it to stay. Fastest I've ever seen. I thought the A7R5 was freaky fast. I came from an A7 IV to an A7R5, A1. The A7 IV was impressive. Then I went to the A7R5 and I was like, hang on a minute, this subject detection thing is pretty damn good. And then that just takes it to another level, really. It's just freaky fast. Silent shutter, I can't even put it into words. My main work is shelter animals, so dogs and cats that come from less than ideal backgrounds. Coming into them as a random guy, you know, walking up with a camera that makes all these clicky noises, the dogs can get quite scared. So I normally have to spend time, you know, waiting for them to calm down and be familiar with me. With a silent shutter, they don't even know I'm taking photos. The dogs just go about their business and I've got 120 photos of them in a second and I can just move on. First moment I picked it up, I kind of was shocked. I thought there wasn't any batteries in it. I even asked you, I was like, is there batteries in this? And you said, yes, there was. It's freaky light. I mean, it's a bit difficult now with a much larger lens on this one, but I can handhold this for an hour, 2 hours at a time, and I'm still just living the dream, basically. I've done 6,645 photos. So culling them should be quite fun, but I'd rather have too many photos than not enough,
So I just got done dropping off the Sony camera at Sony headquarters, and they're gonna take it to a ball game or something, so let's see how they go with that. So basically, this is a really good photo camera. Like, it's very fast, very responsive, but only if you have the right lenses, in all honesty. Like, you really got to take a close look at your lenses and see, do I have the right lenses to help this camera perform? And also, do I have the right SD cards? Not SD cards, CF Express cards, because SD cards are not going to run as well on this. The battery power is pretty damn good. The design is very lightweight and all that. But I think in terms of transitioning from like a mid-range or low-range camera to this high-range camera, you do really want to make sure you have the right memories, the right lenses, the right equipment, because this camera is very capable and has amazing features, but they're only as good as the other bits of equipment attached to it. And as far as a video camera goes, I wouldn't get this for video, in all honesty. The video is nice to have, and the 120 frames is pretty cool, but it's not, you know, it's not a huge video camera to me personally. Autofocus is still amazing, but yeah, it's a very basic standard as far as Sony videos go. Really, you're getting this camera for its photo capabilities. But let me know what you think of this camera in the comments below. If there's anything you want me to be reviewing about these cameras in particular, like particular features or standard specs, please let me know in the comments below. I really do want to sort of start being a bit more broad with these cameras and covering all the bases and the concerns of your typical videographer or photographer. But until then, see you next time.